Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healing and Freedom Journey. Mark DeJesus here. I am your brother from another mother, bringing you insights along the way. I'm all about mental, emotional, and relationship health. And if you are too, you have arrived at a great place. Today, what I want to get into is continuing on the subject of trauma as I engage and invite with you to join me on the trauma healing journey. Today, what I'm going to get into is the signs and symptoms of trauma, because trauma can have a profound and lasting impact on our lives, often manifesting in ways we may not immediately recognize. But I find that it is important to understand trauma isn't just about the event itself that happened, but about the imprint it leaves on our minds, on our spirituality, and our bodies. There are patterns that can continue long after the event has occurred. Trauma can show up in a variety of ways, from emotional struggles like anxiety and depression to physical bodily symptoms and behavioral changes. And I find that recognizing these can be very helpful in steps towards healing, freedom, and recovery. So in this session, what I want to bring to you is some signs and areas of your life that you could look at and over time learn and observe. Of course, in compassionate grace, in kindness, observing where trauma may be playing a role in what seems to be happening in symptoms that are manifesting in your journey. Now, when I get into this, there's a few thoughts that I want to share with you so that you're just aware as we move forward. Please note, this is not meant to replace any therapy you're getting, any of that. You get it. But I also want you to understand, too, that many of these symptoms that I'm going to mention here can relate to other mental health battles, not just trauma. So it's important to keep in mind. You may hear some of these things go, oh, my goodness, there's some trauma that I'm not realizing, and get you off on distracted tangents. I also want you to be aware, too, that although we have similar pathways and similar signs, no two people are exactly alike. How trauma specifically impacts each person can have a variety of ways that it impacts. But what I want to get into is the overall picture and then give you some observations. Here's some things I've seen and I've noticed, because as I became awakened to traumatic impact in my life and the life of people I helped, it sent me on a large, long path of discovery, learning, relearning, learning again, and seeing how it can impact people. And there's something very, very core that I find affects trauma in all kinds of shapes and sizes. And remember this, it's about relational disconnection. That's the battleground that trauma brings about. It unleashes an emotional sense of separation and disconnection, a sense of being disconnected from God, a sense of feeling a divide in your relationship with Him. Also, in feeling that towards the world around you, towards people in your life or relationships that are close to you or even those that are not close to you. And most of all, it can really, and I say most of all because this is often ignored and not understood, is trauma can create a real sense of disconnection with you and yourself. It's a very, very important thing to recognize, even deeper, to understand that trauma will affect a sense of disconnect to your own body. So when you become disconnected to yourself, a variety of things happen, and it can manifest in a variety of ways. It can be as simple as a problem of constantly being lost in your head. It could be chronic anxiety-ridden busyness. It can be a constant self-pressure. There's so much that can be fueled by a sense of self-hatred. It can move into destructive patterns. I'll get into some of those. And things like addictions and ways of numbing, escaping the pain. And there's even obsessive-compulsive patterns that can come out of trauma and things of that nature. But I want to quote this from Peter Levine's book, Healing Trauma. I just find it's a great, great statement. It's a big one there, and I think, forgive me if the letters are too small, but I think you'll be able to see it. He says in his book, Healing Trauma, it's on page 9, in short, trauma is about loss of connection to ourselves, to our bodies, to our families, to others, and to the world around us. This loss of connection is often hard to recognize because it doesn't happen all at once. It can happen slowly over time, and we adapt to these subtle changes sometimes without even noticing them. These are the hidden effects of trauma, the ones most of us keep to ourselves. We may simply sense that we do not feel quite right without ever becoming fully aware of what is taking place. That is the gradual undermining of our self-esteem, self-confidence, feelings of well-being, and connection to life. In his work, The Body Keeps the Score, as I mentioned, great book by Bessel van der Kolk. He mentions trauma, whether it is the result of something done to you or something within something you yourself have done, almost always makes it difficult to engage in intimate relationships. After you've experienced something so unspeakable, how do you learn to trust yourself or anyone again? Or conversely, how can you surrender to an intimate relationship after you have been brutally violated? I found in my journey, and this is just my observation, I want to share this with those of you that are a part of a church body and connected to other believers and to pastors and church leaders. Here's an observation I've discovered, is that people in the church and I'm going to be very just blunt and honest, people that can be very, very difficult in the church. Maybe they're just very, very vocal, very maybe argumentative, or you just struggle to land with them. And during my pastoring, I had many people coming to my church that other churches would recommend they come and attend my church because I emphasize a lot on heart healing and wasn't afraid of talking about mental health battlegrounds and walking a healing and freedom journey. And so I had a lot of experience in very difficult situations. But I found that the ones that, to say it honestly, where church leaders go, we don't know what to do with this person, right? And they're being honest about their limitations. Oftentimes, that person has unaddressed trauma in their life, often highly traumatized people. Because I would sit down and process their story a bit and just be blown away at how much that person had been through. And it really changes how you see people when you understand what they've been through. And I would say this often in my pastoring, because other people would say, this person so-and-so is so difficult. And without, sharing the details of the story, if you knew what that person went through, you'd understand a bit more. It doesn't make unhealthy behavior okay. It adds a lot of compassion and patience, though, to understand what people have been through. So I'm praying in this series is going to give you a lot of compassion for yourself, but also give you another side of seeing other people's journey and maybe what they've been through. So as I dig into this, I pray that this will be insightful for you for your journey and just seeing the signs and symptoms of trauma. I'm going to give some main ones. It certainly isn't everything, but these are important to understand and recognize. The first one right at the top of the list is what makes trauma unique in how it affects people, is the intrusions. And there's a lot of different forms of this. Involuntary and distressing flashbacks, memories, and sensations. And I want to spend some time walking through this, talking about it, so that we can gain some understanding. Now, I use the word involuntary specifically because you didn't choose this for this kind of thing to kick up. It's also distressing, so it's upsetting. It creates a sense of anxiety, discomfort. Oftentimes we use the word triggered, don't we? But the word triggered has become a social word that gets used for a lot of things. But originally, the word triggered was used to describe the after effects of trauma, which often led to what we know of as PTSD. That's originally where that term is utilized. And the thing about trauma-related triggers is that you don't live as though something is in the past. You live as though the past is still present with you. And so that we see, I want to talk about these three things: the flashbacks, the memories, the sensations. Now, when it comes to the flashbacks, it's a rush of feeling like the event itself is happening again. When we think of a flashback, we often attribute it to an actual event replaying in our mind, which is an example of it, but it's more than this. Your body is reacting as though this thing is happening again or even continually happening. The memories can come out of nowhere, but certain environments, certain situations, certain sensations can bring about a triggering experience. It can make you feel that you are reliving that event, even though you are not. It's one of the challenges of trauma. It feels like the emotional interpretation of that event seems to stay with you, as though the event hasn't left. And memories are challenging with trauma. And I'll get into that today, and I'll also get into that in my next session about the challenge of recalling memories. But with traumatic incidences, it can create a scrambling effect to your memories. Sometimes the mind is trying to organize what happened, and so it kind of stirs up a memory to try to piece it together. Many who go through trauma often have a hard time laying out this happened, then this happened, then this happened, that linear kind of approach. It's all over the place. There's flashes, there's moments. Sometimes we see this depicted in how TV and movies will portray a flashback, where it's just kind of a bunch of images. It's a little bit confusing. And some researchers have found that this can be the brain's way of trying to understand or organize or sort out, maybe searching for resolution to make sense of what happened. And so attempts to force these memories out are often ineffective. You can just end up suppressing them. The learning journey is learning how to respond to these flashbacks with renewed approaches. There may be a lot of thoughts that point to all the things you wish you would have done differently, wish happened or didn't happen. You may find yourself jumping into them and trying to fix them. But the work of trauma and flashbacks and these memories, it's a working of where what happened to us infiltrates our life story. And I talk a lot about story. What's the story that you're listening to? What's the narrative? How's the narration of your life and your journey? Because that impacts how we relate to this world, how we relate to what we're going through, how we relate to what we've been through, how we relate to where we're going in our life and our journey. But because of trauma, many can find themselves recycling the same disempowering story in a loop, like repeating it over and over. It becomes an audio track that gets clicked, maybe in conversation. And many are not aware that they're doing this. They're constantly ruminating in the trauma and kind of recycling it over and over again. And there are those who recognize, I'm doing this, but it's like they don't know how to stop it. I know in certain things I'd been through, one of the things I continually struggled with was I felt like I had to keep getting my story out. And I needed everyone to hear what I went through. And I really needed you to understand. And then when I never felt like people understood it enough, so I'd keep going more. I started to observe the pattern of this narrative, how it has taken over my story and my journey. And it's understandable because in counseling, many people, when they enter in, they have a need to get their story fully out there. And many people think when they go to counseling or get help, I can't get help until this person completely understands my story. This kind of dives into a bit of an obsessive compulsive battleground. But I'm noticing my years where people really feel like they got to get it all out. And I encourage people, let you and the person you're working with get to know each other over time. Don't feel this intense pressure to get every detail, all the details out, because you're building rapport. You're building a sense of safety. You're building a sense of being able to work through the layers of things as they pop to the surface. I'm a big believer that trusting in God, that He'll bring up in conversation, in interaction, the things that need to be brought up if we just stick with the process and stick with the journey. But many people think they got to get the whole story out, or there's those that even just getting the story out is very difficult and challenging. They dismiss it. So stupid what I went through. I shouldn't even call this a trauma. Why am I still struggling with this, right? Now, I also want to say when it comes to flashbacks and memories is that getting your story out and talking about what happened is not exactly the same thing as processing what happened. And many people will vent what happened. Or many will suppress it, or a little bit of both. But then when we share it, the raw emotion comes up with it. Eventually, over time, we have to learn how to process what happened. I talk about my materials, the difference between ruminating, processing, the difference between just venting and processing. And what we need is insight to then help us integrate what happened to us into our journey in a way that is redemptive, because that's who God is. Now, Christians often rush to the redemptive part. We hear of someone's trauma, we go, you need to forgive, or just lay it out at the cross. We skip to some answers that are a part of the road, the journey, but don't give room and time to allow the story to come out and allow slowly over time new perspectives to be introduced and applied as a part of the healing journey. Then there's the aspect of intrusive memories. Now, a flashback is you feel like you're going through the whole trauma again. A memory can go into a lot of patterns. It can go into what happened without you reliving it. I find it can even dodge into other memories, because now the pain of this, it kind of goes into a bunch of other areas and transposes that perspective on that. And now the trauma is now interpreting a lot of areas in life. As the body keeps the score, he says, traumatized people have a tendency to superimpose their trauma on everything around them. I think that's a good observation. So we have flashbacks, we have memory kick up, and then we have sensations. And this is where we're being triggered in the 5 physical senses. This is a lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about just being triggered. Anything that could trigger something even remotely close to what we experience. And of course, the 5 physical senses being sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. Allow me a few moments just to talk through them a little bit, because sight is a big one, right? When we understand that the eyes, they have an impact into our inner world, right? And Jesus even talked about when your eyes are good, it's going to bring about good things within. And so it gives us a world of what we're taking in. With trauma, you're taking in something so intense that the sense of looking at it is excruciatingly painful. And many times, because of our traumatic experiences, we can have a hard time just making eye contact, right? Even just looking at someone in the eye. And it often brings our head down. Why? Because there's a fear of what even our eyes are going to take in. And we may see a location, we may see an environment that brings a reaction to our senses. Another area is sound. This is a common one where you can get easily startled. A common example is when someone who's fought in war and has PTSD, now they're back home and the 4th of July is happening and fireworks are going off. They become immediately triggered as though they're in a battle zone, even though they're not. In my research, one of the most fascinating things I discovered about the 5 physical senses is smell. Smell has a unique way that it gets processed in your nervous system and your brain. And it gives us an immediate reaction to smell. And I can link to the article I read on this, but I found one article that helped encapsulate this. There's a woman named Pamela Dalton, a researcher at the Monell Chemical Senses Center in Philadelphia. And she says odors are processed a little differently than other sensory systems because all other sensory systems are routed through a structure in the brain called the thalamus. The thalamus is like a gatekeeper. Okay, so you have all this intake that you go through, it hits the thalamus, and then you start interpreting what it means. So you may smell fresh bread, and that has a connection, maybe even going back to childhood. You smell the rubber that is from a basketball, and you have that recollection of being on the basketball court when you were a teenager. And this can also impact you in a negative way with certain smells from experiences that were not great. Because smell, when it hits when it goes to your brain and your nervous system, it bypasses the thalamus. It doesn't hit the gatekeeper. It goes directly to, what she writes, the primary olfactory cortex. And I don't want to get super nerdy, but it's basically why we experience odors in a different way. When you smell something, and typically, this is kind of an interesting thought, when you say, I smell something, what you're really saying is something new you're smelling. Because you can walk into a room that doesn't smell good, but then you can get used to it as you just kind of remain in there, unless it's super potent, right? So your sense of smell is good at smelling new things that you're introduced to. Somebody walks by and they've got perfume or cologne, or you walk into a bakery and you that initial smell. Once you're in there, that high energy sense of smell starts to become normalized and you get used to it. But because this sense of smell skips the thalamus, you can have a reaction to a smell and go, my goodness, what's wrong with me? So you can have maybe at a traumatic event, somebody was wearing a perfume, and now every time you smell that perfume, you have an immediate reaction of stress. Now, we all have associations, too, when it comes to smell. Certain things create certain just immediate memories. It hits things in a very unique way. So I remember certain people I had in church life, very unsafe interactions with, toxic, even downright abusive moments that I had. And over the years, I could smell a perfume or a cologne, and it would put me right back to that moment without me even realizing it. And so Melissa and I had this conversation where we were talking about sitting at the table, the kitchen table, and smelling food. And she talked about where that has a very pleasant reference for her. She thinks of growing up and her mom cooking and just some nice moments of feeling safe and feeling comfortable. And I was sharing with her that there were times in my life, even in my young adult years, where dinner time, there were a lot of memories of difficult conversations and stress. And so I don't have that same reaction. I actually had to learn to create a new association with sitting at the table, smelling food cooking. It brought up for me other unpleasant memories. And so it was an interesting exercise where I'm learning to renew that. She's connecting to it easier. I'm not as easily connected to it. It's interesting. Practice this in your own journey where you smell something and then all of a sudden you feel anxious. Like, I'm in association with that. And it's a quick recall. I wonder, this is just my own thought. I wonder if this is part of what Jesus was doing with Peter when he came to him and he told him, feed my sheep, when he brought that exhortation to him. And if we rewind back, Peter denied Christ. And just as Jesus predicted, and it happened 3 times, and there's a great deal of shame. And after the crucifixion, Peter says, I'm going to go fishing. There's a sense of like discouragement, loss, grief. I blew it. He goes to fishing. And Jesus, before his official ascension, and he's visiting people, he visits with Peter. And there's something interesting about him visiting. The Bible says that he gets near the fire, where they're cooking the fish, or they're just getting near the fire there. And Jesus is bringing a statement of encouragement. He's meeting Peter in this. Well, if you rewind back to where did Peter have that incident when he denied Christ? It was around the fire where people were warming themselves. And in that, smelling the coals, smelling the burnt firewood, he has a moment of denying Jesus, and that memory is now embedded in him. And so I wonder if it's just curiosity. I wonder if by the fire, when Jesus is now going, Peter, get back in the game. Get back in the game. Feed my sheep. This isn't about failure. This is about you recovering yourself and getting back. A very powerful exchange. I wonder if the smell of fire was being renewed in that experience. I don't know if you sit by. I have a little fire pit in my backyard. That's kind of a place where I like to sit and recalibrate. And when I smell the burnt wood and smell the embers and the smoke, it gives me certain references. What does it do for you? Well, for Peter, that smell of fire would have probably brought up that memory of denying Jesus. And in that moment, Jesus is renewing and saying, get back out there. And it gives us a picture of, as we're healing trauma, we often need renewed experiences with our 5 physical senses, where we see, we hear, we speak, we taste, we touch. There's that interaction in that expression that renews us. So I wanted to submit that to you just for your own learning and your own journey. I find that interesting. There's also the sense of taste, right? Many people after trauma, there's certain things they just lose their appetite for. They lose a sense of taste, or they lose the ability to just enjoy food that's meant to be a pleasurable and enjoyable experience. Taste is also connected to us connecting with one another. The Bible speaks a lot about eating together. God uses that analogy with us. He uses that analogy with people. But trauma steals the joy of that and the enjoyment of it. And lastly on that list is touch, right? Where our ability to feel something, connect to someone, to be able to hug, to embrace, a hand on your shoulder, shaking of hands in agreement. Trauma can really shatter this. First of all, when you have a traumatic flashback or a memory flash or something, what happens? The sensations of your racing heart, anxiousness in your chest, up in your neck, you get stomach pain, back pain, sweating, trembling. There's all these feeling sensations that are now hijacking the system. We also find that those who've been physically or sexually traumatized, especially, but not just those areas, but specifically to them, there is a discomfort with being touched, even if it's healthy. Hugs can feel dirty. Being touched can feel startling and just something to avoid, even if it's a healthy interaction and someone is meaning no harm. It can feel very, very disturbing. And I believe that part of the recovery is allowing our 5 physical senses to experience renewal. That gradually over time, as we're healing, as we're having healthy reflection and experiencing renewal, we need to allow our physiology to be a part of it. And I believe this is even biblical because faith is very spiritual, but yet it's also very physical, and there's a tangible aspect to it because you have to take a step. Your physiology has to be engaged. The ways of God are experienced. And so I find that I need to allow myself to let my sight, my hearing, to let words, to let a sense of touch, connection, receiving a hug. Many people I worked with in church ministry, you just knew they just don't like hugs. They just don't want that. It's scary. It's frightening. Over time, to begin to allow ourselves to be renewed in those areas. This is an important aspect of the healing journey to take place. That's why I'm a big believer in just engaging your physiology and for going for nice walks, enjoying creation, looking, paying attention to your senses. What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you touch when you grab a leaf from the ground or grab a branch? To just allow your senses to re-engage and be reconnected to your senses once again. It takes time. It takes practice. The second area I want to get into is signs of traumatic impact is sleep negatively impacted. This is at the top of the list because trauma affects your ability to feel safe, to wind down, to enter into peace. Sleep is an exercise of letting go. I am safe, I'm letting go, and you don't go to sleep, you more fall asleep, right? It's like releasing yourself and letting yourself go into what's needed for recovery. Well, trauma can communicate to the fight or flight system. You are not safe. The hypothalamus sends signals, amygdala sending signals. You're not safe. You're not okay. So it makes night season, it makes sleep difficult. So many can have an inability to fall asleep, inability to stay asleep, lots of nightmare kind of battlegrounds. Or maybe there's a high level of added things that are needed. Maybe you need I know many people, they need the TV on while they're falling asleep. Or maybe you need earbuds or need something you're listening to, because just being by yourself, laying there in bed, it's difficult to make that transition of being okay within yourself. And so when sleep is negatively impacted, mental health is negatively impacted. As I share often, when people ask, what's the pathway in improving mental health? I'd put at the top of the list is healthy sleep patterns, because many phenomenal things take place when you sleep. But again, it's a letting go. And when you've had significant trauma, letting go is a very, very difficult experience. A third area I want to bring up is irritability. And I can also include in this outbursts of anger, usually random outbursts of anger. But I don't believe outbursts of anger are necessarily random. They usually do have something they're connected to that we may or may not be aware of. But trauma will have a significant impact on overall mood, especially because trauma creates a lot of hostility within yourself, a lot of fussing within yourself, a lot of conflict within yourself, and even turning against yourself. So when you're at war within yourself, it fuels irritability. And this irritability can now just connect to overall mood issues. You're at war within yourself. So when you interact with the world around you, that irritability can get easily triggered. Now, I find that irritability is rooted in shame and self-hatred, because when you learn to operate compassionately with yourself, it helps take the irritability, put it in perspective. It may not necessarily make it all go away, but it helps you process it with greater gentleness and compassion. But trauma really fires away at self-hatred and shame. In my work, I find men can really struggle with this because they will take trauma and shove it way down. Deny it, put it away. Dealing with it is very uncomfortable. But they have this constant irritability that is at work. And they can be easily triggered by their wives or their kids, something happening, and you're like, what's going on with him? People can say around. But there's a lot of inward anger that can be directed towards self. And so therefore, when you are at hostile odds with yourself, it doesn't take much for somebody to trigger that, and then anger kicks out. There's also the sense of overreacting, or like a misplaced anger, where you become easily triggered. You have an angry outburst that doesn't seem proportionate to what took place. Maybe you watch something even on the news, and I've seen people just seeing something on the news and they go from 0 to 60, right? Is it the news event that's triggering them? Yeah, but it has to do with what that news event represents to their traumatic history. That's now kicking it up. Maybe a heavy sense of justice or injustice, or maybe a certain theme of the notice that is highly related to something that they've been through. Then there's this sense of intense, aggressive argumentativeness. I've seen people with, when that trauma gets hit and that irritability gets hit, they can get aggressive, where I even feel like, whoa, this could get physical. Been in many situations where I'm like, this could get really, really rough really quick. Where then even I'm going, this, I'm feeling unsafe right now. So this fuels a lot of family tension, conflict, and strife, because the person's just unable to settle their inner faculties. So this now also ties into another thing. It's hyperarousal. Hyperarousal is it can go into a lot of different areas where your state is highly prone to a more anxious state. This is now where your fight or flight system gets hijacked. And there's the principle of fight or flight. In other words, I got to gear up, that anxiety gear up, I got to fight off something, or that anxiety gears up to go, I got to get out of here, displacement, right? It can kick into avoidance. I'll get into avoidance in a minute. Then in a lot of trauma research and understanding, they introduce the aspect of freezing or fawning, where freeze, just you freeze up, you lock up. which is very, very, very common, happens, or a sense of fawning, almost like the picture of like someone like yawning. It's like a disconnect kind of moment and trying to cope with the situation at hand and what you're going through. Basically, the alarm system is getting triggered, and then it continually gets triggered, and you can become hypervigilant. The Bible talks about be sober, be vigilant, but it's not hypervigilant. When you're hypervigilant, feelings are on alert to danger and constant on guard. Fight or flight is continually in this protective mechanism. The picture that comes to mind, I don't know why this comes to mind for me, but it's like the imagery of someone every time they go to a restaurant, they have to sit with their back to the wall so they can see the door of anyone who comes in. I don't know, maybe I watch too many TV shows or things that show that kind of picture, but it's a sensing you're in danger when there is no danger, constantly checking for danger when there is no danger, but you're just always on a high alert lookout. So then there's exaggerated and overreactive responses, like easily triggered, easily startled, just out of nowhere. You can be easily triggered into anxiety that you can't seem to come down from. In fact, for those with trauma, peace is a hard thing to come by. So anxiety, panic attacks, paranoia. This is a whole branch that could take place. A mindset of people are out to get me. So now what happened to you by a person or by people can get transposed on the world. The world is dangerous, and I need to be on the lookout now. And so that paranoia kicks in, and paranoia can go to a lot of different levels of intensity. There's the aspect of suspicion, where I'm just highly suspicious of people. And you may lean towards being suspicious in a lot of areas. Why? Because trauma shatters your sense of trust. You can develop major, major trust issues. You have a super hard time with trust. Now, when trust is there, life is so much better. It's low maintenance. It's more efficient. It's smooth. When trust is lost, life gets really complicated. It gets exhausting. It's very anxiety ridden. And so we have to understand that it really triggers how we relate to people, how willing we are to trust. Now, I think there's wisdom in our healing of, okay, people need to earn trust to a sense. I'm not going to be so quick to just let it all there, but I don't want to imprison myself and say I'll never trust again. Because at some point, we've got to learn to open up trust over time. There was an interesting quote I read. I forget where I saw it, but this is how it went. A cat that sits on a hot stove lid won't ever sit on a hot stove lid again, but it probably won't sit on a cold stove lid either. And that applies to how trauma affects us. It's like, yeah, okay, I won't do that again, but then it can blanket into our relationships in a lot of different ways and a lot of different pathways. Another aspect is authority issues. We can develop in our trust because many traumatic experiences happen with someone in authority. A parent, an uncle, an aunt, a babysitter, a pastor, a teacher. Someone who had a place of authority where they were supposed to be safe and they were not. I saw this a lot in pastoring when people were new to the church. You could just see them going, who is this guy? I don't know if I can trust him. And because I had an awareness of these issues that people struggle with, I respect that. It's fine. I'm not expecting you to just throw your trust my way. Take your time, because I prefer that too. Because I also saw that many people in my pastoring work, I could see trauma in two ways with regard to this. One was, I don't trust this guy at all. Then I would see others just wanting to cling onto me as though I was their like new dad, like right away. And both were unhealthy kind of ways of reacting, but they're both understandable if you understand trauma. Another aspect is avoidance. And this can go into a lot of areas. It's fueled by fear. It's fear has now fueled how I'm walking away from the experience. And so it surrounds a lot of things. And avoidance can happen in how I deal with my thoughts. Avoidance can happen in how I get help or don't get help, how I relate to people. To think upon what happened is so upsetting that many just try to never think about it ever again. because when it kicks up, they feel overwhelmed. They don't know how to cope. But when you start avoiding that, then you can start avoiding triggers, and then the trigger avoidance expands. We can even get to a place where we develop just a lot of don't go there subjects. I've seen even in conversations, you can pick up on don't go there subjects, traumatic don't go there subjects. We can get into stuffing down, shoving down all of it, or just in denial, don't go there. My concern is where it leads into dismissiveness, because many can dismiss what they've been through. They can dismiss what they've experienced. Then there are those who can not only do that, they can be dismissive of others. I wonder in church, because I have a lot of experience in church life, I wonder if a lot of pastors and church leaders that are super dismissal to mental health, I wonder it's because they're afraid of addressing their own pain and their own even trauma that they've experienced. You know, a lot of this like, yeah, mental health, psychology is baloney. You just need to give things to Jesus. Just get over it. I wonder that people that are very aggressive in that kind of way, if they have unaddressed trauma in their own life, and because of that, it's a don't go there subject for them. So we can escape, we can push it away. There's the aspects of emotional numbness and shut down. When we're shut down, there's our emotional capacity has hit tilt. And what we're needing to get back to flexing and using those muscles, right? It's not that the muscle's gone and you're just too far gone. It's more that it's exhausted your resources. And at some point, the work is learning how to activate those relational muscles of learning to notice what you're feeling, but do the work of compassionately responding to it. Learn to invite new healthy interpretations versus the old interpretations that come in. Learning to engage new physiological responses. But our shutdown and numbness can be a form of coping. Another aspect of trauma is the aspect of confusion, disorientation, difficulty with concentration. Confusion over how you see things. It's confusing how to place even your story in your life. It's like, who am I now? And where am I in all this? I find in my experience, I talk about ADHD from time to time, now and again, the people that have attention issues, many have traumatic childhoods where it kept them in a constant anxious state, because anxiety has a major influence in attention issues. And there are those they feel all over the place in their story, in their journey. And trauma can do that. It can cause a disorganization. And then it gets reflect and feeling disorganized in your life. Right? And this is where these things can go down different pathways, because some of you can feel like, oh, I just feel like I'm just a mess. I'm just disorganized all over the place. Some can be highly controlling, and they have their routines and they have their things, and they have a highly controlled environment that they create and live in. And if you get off that path, it triggers a sense of unsafety and anger and irritability and anxiety, right? So a lot of different pathways this can go through. We have to bring up, when it comes to trauma, the shame and toxic guilt factor. Shame's right there. It wants to be right there to cause you to turn on yourself and give you a destructive interpretation over what happened, everything you feel. So you stay in, what's the matter with me? Why can't I get it together? You can get into a blame game. And for those of you that I'm speaking to your journey, I highly encourage you to go into my topics and go through the toxic guilt series and go through the shame series I put together. Those things have been so helpful for me and those that I've helped, because shame gets you into a blame game where you're blaming yourself. You can get locked into a loop of blaming God. God, where were you? What'd you do? Trying to find, what is God saying? And there's like a blame. There's blaming people, blaming around you, right? And blame is understandable, but it doesn't produce healing. Blame is understandable as a reaction, but it doesn't produce healing. And what shame does is it creates more isolation. You feel like it's just you in darkness with this battle that you have. And now how you interpret things, that toxic guilt is creating all these inappropriate guilt is a good word to use, but these inaccurate perceptions of things. Inappropriate guilt ties into depression, which I'll get to in just a second. It's a common symptom of depression. And one of the classic examples, again, I go to military examples a lot because it's where a lot of research has discovered things, where military soldiers, where they had somebody who died, they can feel like I'm still alive, and they feel guilty for feeling alive. Why am I alive? I should have died too. So moving on becomes incredibly difficult. And that toxic guilt shame combo really inflates that. And of course, we have the aspect of depression that comes into play. And I think all of us are familiar with the reality that trauma can cause depression. But I also want to talk about disillusionment. Trauma can drive a person into deep, deep depression and an inability to experience emotion, a loss of interest in activities you used to find pleasure and enjoy, a loss of enjoyment or even the ability to look forward to things, feeling distant from others, socially isolating. You can feel numb, checked out, unable to feel, lack of motivation, fatigue, hopelessness, worthlessness, appetite changes, loss of interest in sex, in marriage, and now your spouse is feeling that lack of connection, inappropriate struggles with guilt and shame. I mentioned that. Difficulty trusting others. You can get, and even the aspects of self-harm, suicidal thoughts, and those kind of things as well, too. This is all feeding a sense of disconnection. And depression has a lot of disconnection in it. Feeling disconnected from my story, my journey, from what I enjoy. Then there's the aspect of disillusion. And this word is an interesting word because it speaks of the breakdown or disintegration or decay. It's like things are collapsing in your life. Like the structure of your life. It's like if you go through trauma in a church setting where there's spiritual abuse and you have to leave the church. It's like your whole structure of attending church and connecting to other believers and your role in the church is all collapsing. Pastors who have had church trauma and they had to leave and now they're just wandering. Like they feel a sense of wandering. Where am I? Now, healing through disillusionment can be a very, very powerful process. But it's also painful because it involves rebuilding. Now, some of the structure that fell apart has some weak aspects to it that need rebuilding, restructuring. I know for me, any sense of disillusionment has brought me back to the foundation of God's love and His grace and the Word of God and anchoring myself in simplicity. But I don't want to rush to like, oh, this can be a great experience because I want you to show the symptoms because many of you relate to this. You just feel disillusioned. It's like, what's the point of church? What's the point of, right? And that's depression and disillusionment talking. And that needs coaching and help to walk through because those ugly feelings and those ugly emotions, we're often afraid of. Get them away from me. Solve it. Pray it out of me. God, get it away. And I am always encouraging the process of not getting away, not avoiding them. We're going to walk through them. The journey of all healing is a journey through things in our life. And that's going to be very, very important for us to keep in mind. So what I also want to bring up is this aspect of self-destructive and erratic behaviors. This can get into self-harm or even certainly suicidal tendencies and so forth. But there can be excessive behaviors like excessive partying, erratic driving behaviors, being very aggressive, heavy speeding or things like trying too many aggressive things and maybe get into like excessive adventures of highly dangerous kind of things. I also noticed too that things like even getting tattoos. Many times people can wear the trauma on their skin. My goal here is not to break down tattoos and get into Christian arguments about it. It's just an observation. And part of getting a tattoo, there's a bit of a mild pain that comes with it. And when you look at their tattoos, you're seeing their pain. So a name of someone who died, imagery of something that it speaks of a hurt in their life. Many can even get repeated tattoos. And that can be a very clear sign of trauma and unaddressed trauma, especially. But it can include a lot of things. Like I mentioned, thrill-seeking, reckless behavior, and things that can be harmful to you. Super risky kind of stuff. And you understand what I'm saying there. To many in my community, I want to bring this out. Because many of you have obsessive-compulsive, perfectionistic influences in your life. And there is a perfectionistic survival coping mechanism that comes into play with trauma. The first, right at the top of the list, is you become highly focused on making sure that you do everything just right. So you even afterwards start replaying, did I do this right? Do that. So you start going, oh, I did this wrong. I should have done this right. And now you're spinning to try to find a way to correct it. In trauma recovery, there is black and white thinking we can get into of the good guys and bad guys. That person is 100% evil and I'm good. And we create these, kind of protective ways of dealing with people. So then in future relationships, many perfectionists will do this. We quickly write off people. So if you've had a hurt from someone in the past, if anyone comes even close to it, you just write them off. I'm done with them. I'm done with them. How many of you have that response come up within you? I'm done with them. I'm done. You want to write somebody off? You want to reject them before they ever have any room to potentially reject you. But going back to my initial statement in this, I found in my life that I would spin about, did I do the right thing? And it wouldn't allow me to actually heal through what happened because I was focused on blaming myself, focused on, did I do the right thing? Did I do the wrong thing? God, did I do the right thing, wrong thing? When trauma's messy, it's just messy what it brings about in us. So it wouldn't let me heal. Many can even get into compulsive behaviors where that they intensify now. Your cleaning, your washing, your busyness, your hyper spirituality, right? Your routines, intense perfectionism, performance-driven behaviors, fixating on following the rules. This now leads into our control issues. And trauma massively inflames control issues. I will never, ever have anything like that happen again, so we build a fortress over ourselves. And this now becomes a safety behavior kind of thing. And for trauma strugglers that have experienced trauma but have perfectionistic tendencies, they go highly controlled. Highly controlled. We also have an increase in addictions that takes place. Why? Addictions are the most common way that we avoid pain and move towards pleasure to escape our feelings, to escape ourselves. Now, we all have things that become, you could call them dependencies or things that you just do that you could classify in this, even our coffee drinking or whatever. But what I'm getting at here is things that we do that disconnect us from feeling through the pain in our life and in our journey. I find others can even go into what I'm going to call distracting tangents, which means like working through emotions and what they've been through is too messy. I saw this in church life every day, all the time. So they get lost in all kinds of subject tangents. Now, some are obsessive compulsive. So they have intrusive thoughts. They're chasing that. And they never deal with trauma. So, for example, someone who's been sexually abused, they're hyper-focused on making sure that they repent well and they do what's right and their thought life is right. And they're hyper-spiritualizing, hyper-compulsive in how they practice their spiritual walk. But they don't give themselves room to heal through. They're so distracted in fixing their tangents. Does that make sense? You get lost in your obsessive topics. Some can get workaholism. It's a very common thing. That's something that you feel you can control, so you go to work, spend longer times at work, fixate on that because your control levels work there. I find many who are traumatized can get fixated on certain distortions in reading Scripture. A common one is reading the Old Testament and seeing moments where God's anger is mentioned, right? And get lost in tangents. I've heard many, that have traumatic history. They kind of get fixated on that anger and they can't see anything else. They just see that and they dive into that. Some have even get into things like, well, God is just, he must be this narcissistic person. And why would God send his son to be traumatized and abused, right? That's an example of taking trauma now and putting it into the Bible in a way that's not letting you take in insight and revelation in a healthy way. I find many traumatized people who don't address their pain and their wounds can get obsessive, compulsive about even their Bible involvement, Bible teaching, get into deep dives. Some can be content creators, some can be class teachers. They just obsess over the subjects that they write on and dig in. They get lost in their office. They ignore their family. They ignore loved ones because they're not dealing with their pain effectively. So now these things that look great, oh, he's teaching, oh, she's teaching, they get out of priority. The family's being neglected. Marriages are being neglected. I personally think that people who get lost in intense arguments about doctrine and they're angry and argumentative, there's something there traumatically that has had an influence, that they get fired up in that kind of way. Now, all of us get our triggers hit, right? It doesn't always mean trauma. But I just wonder, is that coming out? And the need to be right, because I can't be wrong, and that's my survival mechanism, is I do the right thing. It works in Christianity a lot. And so I want to include in this is hyper busy living. When you're traumatized, it hijacks your anxiety system and your fight or flight. So what happens is we often match. So here's our anxiety. Instead of working to bring down anxiety, work through anxiety, we take our lifestyle and match the buzz. This is a common mainstream today practice, that your daily activity matches the buzz of unrest within you. And so in church life, this is the people that are hyper in constant activity, constant. And the church goes, oh, you're so great. You have such a servant's heart. We never take a moment to go, hey, can you chill? To bring about, like Jesus did with Mary and Martha, that, hey, yeah, we need both, but don't neglect the important thing of just relating intimately and just and vulnerably relationship connection. Because relationship connection is scary for people that have trauma and even just mental health struggles in general. But many of these people in church, they'll go, oh, don't worry about me. Translation: I'm uncomfortable talking about myself. Just something to bring in our awareness. But with trauma, there can be multiple somatic complaints that have no medical reason, because trauma creates imprint in the physical body. And we're trying, why am I got this back issue, right? Oh, a shoulder, right? Kind of thing that's going on. It often depends on where stress goes for you. So that's important for you to understand. But these symptoms, all these things, they could rise, they could come and go away. Typically, when somebody has a lot of these in a consistent pattern, it's not going away after a month or a couple months. It's a sign that they may be leading towards what's called PTSD. But in this talk, and today as I bring this out, because what I want to do is just like each time, layer by layer, bring it out. And thank you for trusting me. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you for trusting me to talk about this issue. Because I know it's delicate. I know it's very painful for some. It goes into abuse growing up, abuse in church, abuse at the workplace. It gets into things you've experienced that were just awful. I thank you for allowing me to be able to speak into this. And my two takeaways is, one, learn in all things to be compassionate. You're going to feel things. You're going to feel emotions. Be compassionate about it. And allow yourself to lovingly, soberly notice. Okay, yeah, that thing Mark talked about there, yeah, I see that in my life. And just add to my awareness. Add to my awareness. This isn't about having a panic reaction. This is about hurry up and fix me today. In fact, I completely discourage seeking out these quick fix because there's a lot of quick fix hustlers out there. And I want to discourage chasing those down, because many who've been through trauma, they want the quick fix or the perfect technique. In upcoming episodes, what I'm going to talk about is, why does trauma affect people in a variety of different ways? What is it about that? I want to talk about what the Bible says about trauma to give you some biblical perspectives. I want to talk about how trauma affects us spirit, soul, and body, and get a deeper understanding of that. And we're also going to get into PTSD, complex PTSD as well, too. And I'll give you recommendations and things along the way. And then long term, I'm going to have some trauma healing tips that I want to provide. So just here's simple things we can engage as a part of our healing journey. Has this been a blessing to your life? I pray that it has. And I want to take a moment and pray, but could you do me a favor? Could you click that like button and click subscribe? You can also go over to markdejesus.com where I have all kinds of resources, materials, a topics page that's organized. You can go through and see things by topic. I also have books that you can get a hold of, my latest book being the OCD Healing Journey. That can be a great resource for those of you that have obsessive compulsive struggles. I also have a healing and freedom community where I do deeper investments with people there. You have access to my courses. You have access to my materials in a deeper way, training courses, as well as Q&As and forum interaction as well, too. You can support these broadcasts by going to markdejesus.com and clicking on the donate button. But what I'd like to do is just take a moment to pray for you. If you made it this far, I want to say a prayer over your life and over your journey. Father God, I come to you in Jesus' name, thanking you that I'm your son and that I can be a brother to people that are listening to this and watching this. I thank you that I have the opportunity to be able to share on these topics, and I love working on it, putting it together, sharing helpful insights. I pray that, number one, that they would connect to the reality that you love them and they're on a journey, and that healing and freedom journey is a glorious journey, but it has some valleys, it has some difficult aspects to it. And there's a work of the heart. But that work flows out of your love and your grace. You love us and you have grace towards us, and I thank you for that. I ask for mercy to continue. And I pray that what was helpful for remembrance would just remain, and that they'd be able to put it to application in how they see themselves, how they see you, and how they see their life and their journey. Most of all, I just thank you that I have the opportunity to share these things with my brothers and with my sisters. So I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Lord willing, the creek don't rise. This is your brother from another mother saying, I'll be back with more insights in the trauma healing journey. But in the meantime, I'm out.